Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to today's session with Professor Salil Kanhere. I'm really excited about presenting Professor Kanhere's work today, actually, because it's really cutting edge work. Just to give a quick introduction to him, he's worked in the US and he's a professor here at University of New South Wales and a member of IFCYBER. He's done a plethora of work looking at Internet of Things, cyber physical systems, blockchain, pervasive computing, machine learning. I mean, I don't know if you ever sleep at night, Salil. And I'm really excited about this talk because I did work with a big group of people many years ago on looking at this identification, with looking at the body as well as psychological factors. And just even reading Salil's abstract, I can see that the science has moved on an awful lot, and it's really important work for us all to know about. So I'm really excited to present Salil's work. Just so people know, I'd love people to be asking questions in the Q&A section rather than the chat section, if that's okay. And at the end of Salil's talk, I will ask Salil your questions for you. So thank you very much. I'm passing it over to you, Professor Kanhere.
Thank you, Monica and Kirsty, for organizing this, and of course, IFCYBER for giving me the opportunity. So this work was largely led by two of my PhD students who have since graduated. So the first piece of work was led by Saeed. He's just started at Deakin, actually, a couple of weeks ago. The second piece I'll present was led by Jin, who's currently at Shenzhen. So the context of this work largely is, as Monica mentioned, pervasive computing, right? So the sort of father of pervasive or ubiquitous computing is generally referred to as Dr. Mark Weiser. He was at Xerox PARC, and he came up with this notion that you would have all these sensors or what we call IoT devices embedded everywhere, which would be collecting all sorts of ambient information, which can then get analyzed and processed, and certain actions can then be manifested in our environment. And the key point he was making was all of this should just exist without us noticing it. So essentially the pervasive computing infrastructure becomes embedded in our ambient spaces. And to some extent, this is starting to happen now. I'm sure some of you are currently in a space where there are some IoT sensors around you. So be it a smart home or be it a smart office, be it even shopping. So Amazon Go, for example, is a very good example of this. Beyond that, we also have a lot of elderly individuals living by themselves in their homes, and they are assisted by all sorts of IoT devices, monitoring their behavior, essentially trying to estimate if they're having some health problems. So broadly speaking, you can sort of, the way I'll pitch this talk is two settings, right? So we have a typical setting, which most of us are very familiar with. So when we are entering a secure space, be it an office building, be it your housing complex or so on and so forth, you typically need some way to authenticate yourself before you are given access to that space. And the second sort of domain that I'll be exploring is more of a smart home or a smart space setting, where we are increasingly seeing applications where we want to personalize these spaces, right, based on our personal desires. So for example, if you're in a room and you want the lighting to be set in a certain way, you want the air conditioning to be set in a certain way, and so on. And then similarly, you have scenarios where, as I mentioned earlier, you might have elderly people who need some assistance while living by themselves. And you need the space to sort of recognize who the person is in order to make adjustments that are better suited to their needs. So that's how sort of I'll be pitching this work. Now, where are we at currently, right? So if you look at that first scenario where we are trying to enter spaces, I mean, most of these things have been in existence for years, right? I mean, in many buildings today, we still use swipe cards, right? And as we all know, I mean, we are all cybersecurity researchers, so we kind of know that's not a very secure way to access these spaces, or even PIN codes for that matter. We are seeing some sort of new technologies being used, so things like smart locks and so on and so forth. But again, we've found a lot of problems with all of these because they can be hacked and so on and so forth. There's also a fair bit of biometrics now being used. I mean, all of us use that on our phones, for example. So of course, fingerprints have been around for some time now. However, it's not too hard to actually fake fingerprints. There's lots of YouTube videos you can find. This is something I picked off YouTube, where they'll show you how to actually fake someone's fingerprint, and it works for the most part, right? There's also face recognition, again, used on phones and various other scenarios. And again, hackers have shown that this can be manipulated using pictures and sort of creating masks and so on and so forth. Another technology that's coming up is iris scanning, where the idea is to scan the iris of your eye. It's been used in some niche phones, and this also has been shown to be prone to hacks. So in this first piece of work, I'll be focusing on this setting where we are trying to get access to a particular sort of space or a device, for example. And in that context, we presented earlier this year this work called vein ID. So the idea is that we are trying to use vein patterns to identify individuals. Now, this work did get picked up in the media, so you see some snapshots here of the work appearing in CNN, New Scientist, and even got to go on ABC radio here and talk about this. So the contribution really was to demonstrate that we can use vein patterns to identify individuals, and mainly we can do this on commodity hardware. So in the past, there has been work on this, but that requires a lot more specialized hardware than what we were trying to do. And we actually demonstrated all this through a proof of concept. So these are some pictures of some past work that have been done in this space. So here on the left, you see one of the first works in this space. And this is a very complex piece of hardware. It's got like 48 infrared LEDs and a CCD camera. And then we've noticed there are some banks, for example, that are using some of this technology. But again, all of this is fairly proprietary, and it's specially designed for their purposes. So what we really wanted to explore was, okay, we are seeing a lot of depth cameras now appearing on the market for various reasons, because they've got the fact that these cameras give you the depth of what you're capturing can be very useful for all sorts of computer vision applications, right? So a very good example is collision avoidance in autonomous vehicles. So our idea was to try to use these off-the-shelf cameras to see if we could actually get this to work. So what we actually used in our experiment is what's shown there, or maybe you can see this here. So this is this Intel RealSense camera. And of course, there are other examples of this. Some of the Samsung phones have depth sensors. Some of the webcams also come with depth sensors, and so on and so forth. So the setup that we envisioned was what's depicted here, right? So you might have a depth capturing depth camera type device. We illustrate that as a phone, but it could be any small embedded device. And we asked the user to essentially place their hand on a certain surface at a roughly fixed distance from the camera and make a fist. And the reason we ask people to make a fist is because if you make a fist right now and look at your hand, you'll see that your veins kind of pop out. And the second reason being, by making a fist, the portion that we're trying to capture, the vein pattern, actually pops up compared to the rest of the surface. So we can actually use that depth information to focus on the veins and then extract them. So this is the pipeline that we use. We capture two images, a depth image and an IR image. And I'll walk you actually through some of these steps. I won't spend too much time on this. There's one bit that I'll not focus on in this talk, just for the sake of time. There's this intruder detection module, which we've also designed. And the reason we need this is because if you look at most sort of identification or classification algorithms, right, they'll try to classify an individual to one of the sort of enrolled samples, essentially the closest resembling individual. And we don't want that to happen, right? We want an individual who's not enrolled in the system to be detected as an intruder. So for that, we had to design a secondary classifier to be able to detect the intruder. So I'll skip that bit in this talk. So here you see two images. This one is the infrared image, essentially, that's captured by the infrared sensor. And this is the depth information that we obtain, right? And both are captured at exactly the same time. So as you already can see in the infrared image, you can kind of very clearly see the vein patterns already emerging. And here we are just seeing some depth information. And I mean, it's a bit hard to see here, but this dark part is sort of indicating that it's raised compared to the rest of the surface. So we use some very simple heuristics to be able to focus on the region of interest, which is the vein patterns that we are trying to extract. And we try to estimate the hand boundary. So this is all done based on the depth information, because it's fairly straightforward to do this using some simple thresholds. And then we can exclusively focus on the hand boundary and remove the rest of the image. Now, once we do that, we need to zoom in and pick out the exact vein patterns. So here again, we leverage the fact that the veins are illuminated in a different way by the infrared image. So the pixel values corresponding to the specific veins in the picture are less than the values of the adjacent pixels that do not contain the veins, because the blood in the veins actually attenuates the infrared light differently compared to the other tissues in your arms. So that allows us to essentially extract out the vein patterns by just looking at the pixel values. So I won't go into the actual algorithm, but essentially we just create squares and we try to estimate the average, and based on that we can extract out the vein. So this is actually the output of this algorithm, where you already see the vein pattern sort of emerging very nicely, but however, it's still fairly noisy because you can't directly use this for identification. Next, we focus on connected components. This is again a very standard computer vision algorithm. I won't get into all the details here, but the idea being you try to find a connected pattern in that noisy image. And you'll see that the most dominant one essentially is the one that contains this whole sequence of veins on your arms. So we can then use this connected component algorithm to extract out that particular vein pattern. Now, in terms of the usage of this system, just like any other pattern, I mean, any other authentication system, right? We expect that users who are using the system will have to enroll and give some samples of their veins, just like you do when you're setting up your phone, right? You sort of have to give the system a few samples of your fingerprint. So similarly, we assume you would go through a training phase where we would collect a few samples from the users, and then next, all of those images would go through that same pipeline, and now we need to do the actual identification, right? So we need to identify this test pattern and match it against one of the individuals who's enrolled. So for that, we use machine learning, and in particular, we by looking at various algorithms, we chose to use deep learning. And we actually tried out two algorithms, the first one being CNN, which you see here. Now, again, I won't go into all the nitty-gritty of this pipeline. This is I mean, as with most deep learning work, this is something you kind of trial and sort of adjust based on the results you're getting. So here we have the input layer, which is the image, the depth image that you saw from the previous, the vein pattern actually from that you saw from the previous slide, which is then passed through a convolutional layer. There's a ReLU layer following that. There's a pooling layer, and then we repeat that same sequence. The output of this second pooling layer is basically the local features that are learned from the different parts of the vein pattern. So what we're trying to do is essentially determine the features that allow us to uniquely identify individuals. And then we feed those, we sort of unflatten them into a large vector and feed it to these sequence of 4 fully connected layers. And the output layer is just the classifier, essentially. So that's the number of people who are being enrolled in the system. So in our case, as I'll talk of later, we've used 35 subjects. So as you notice here, the output layer, the size of this is 35. And this is essentially, it uses a softmax activation function to compute the probability for each user in the enrolled set. A second model that we also tested is what's called a stacked autoencoder. So this is basically an unsupervised learner. It reconstructs the input at the output, achieving a minimal mean square error. And here we actually found that having a second autoencoder, so you notice there are 2 autoencoders back to back, helped us improve the accuracy. We also use a softmax layer, and then the output is, as shown earlier, of the size of the number of users enrolled. So experiments. Now, the thing here is we couldn't use any existing data sets. There are some data sets out there which capture Wayne patterns, but they're captured using much more sophisticated hardware than what we were after. So we couldn't just use those because that sort of defeats the whole purpose. Our idea was to use off-the-shelf equipment. So we had to collect our own data. And if you have done some of these kind of experiments, you may appreciate it's very hard to actually do this at a very large scale. So certainly, I mean, 35 users is perhaps not a lot, but I think this is the best we could do in those circumstances. In fact, this was just as lockdown was happening last year. So that, in fact, created lots of problems for us, but we just managed to get this data out before everything closed down. So that shows you some of the statistics of the users. These are mainly people working at university, all from different countries. And one interesting thing we found was the patterns that we were extracting, they were kind of independent of skin color and things like that, because that has no bearing on these images that are captured here through the infrared camera. So that was a good finding. And we collected 500 images per volunteer. We simply sort of showed them how to collect the data, and they were free to sort of move their hand around a little bit. We didn't really enforce that they have to keep it at a very specific spot and so on and so forth. So it was kind of, we were trying to capture a more natural setting of where this system could be used. The module, most of the Wayne extraction was done on MATLAB, but all the machine learning was just done on a standard laptop and GPU cluster. So we actually found very high accuracy. So these are what are called ROC curves, right? So you see all the ROC curves are around the top left corner. So, and as you see here, the accuracy is almost 100%, precision and recall is also almost 100%, and the F1 score is 99%. So this is a very good result for that particular data set. And in terms of the time taken to train and test this system, so this is sort of comparing the results for the 2 models I showed you on 2 different pieces of hardware. So obviously on a standard laptop, it takes a little longer, of course, to train it. However, training, even in an sort of pervasive computing environment, right, you could still do the training offline because that's not something you need to do online. So if you could imagine that training could happen on a sophisticated GPU server. The testing, however, could still take place on an embedded device. So for example, here, even on a simple laptop, not just a basic laptop that all of us use, we were able to show that the detection can happen in less than a second with both models. Okay. So yeah, there's a bunch of other results in the paper, so I won't bore you with all of that. You can certainly look up the paper or reach out to me if you're interested. So I'll move now to the second bit of the work. So this was more sort of a single shot authentication, if you may. This second piece of work is looking at a more sort of pervasive setting where you have people sort of in a smart space and you're trying to detect these people as they may be moving around, coming in, and so on and so forth. So this work, we've actually gone through 2 iterations of this. The first very preliminary work was published about 3 years ago, this paper called Wi-Fi ID. And since then, we've been doing a lot of refinements. And the work I will present today is this refined work that you see here. So 3 years ago, this was actually picked up by Dr. Karl. And in fact, that's Jin, my student. We got to go and meet Dr. Karl and do a short segment with him. So that was really interesting. So the key contributions of this work were that we were able to show that human gait imprints a very unique pattern on Wi-Fi signals. And in fact, we were able to even detect the direction of walking in that particular setting that I'll show you. And we were able to demonstrate all of this actually works on off-the-shelf hardware and get reasonable accuracy in a small group setting. So here you'll see the accuracy numbers are a little lower. And this is largely because of the problems of dealing with the Wi-Fi setting. So why Wi-Fi? Well, because if you think about it, Wi-Fi is everywhere, right? It's all around in your living spaces, in your workspaces, in shopping centers, anywhere you go, there's Wi-Fi, right? So this, for example, shows you a screenshot of the access points I see in my apartment, right? And it's very typical to what you might see where you live, right? Now, the thing here is the human body is actually an interferer. It's an interfering source to radio frequency signals because we are all made up of water. So it acts both as a reflector and absorber of RF energy. So we are causing a lot of disturbance to the Wi-Fi signals around us. Now, the good thing though is that if you sort of, whenever you create certain actions, right, you're creating an interference in the Wi-Fi spectrum. And the good thing there is if you create that same action again and again, you actually see a repeatable pattern that emerges in the interference that you create. And there's been a lot of work in this space, not just our group, there's groups all around the world who are working on this. So these are some examples of certain motions you might be doing, right? And the patterns that those create essentially in the Wi-Fi spectrum. Now, in order to do some of this work, you need to sort of go and pull out what's called the fine-grained channel state information that's actually used by the Wi-Fi protocols to improve transmission. So if you look at the current Wi-Fi standards, when you're transmitting on a particular channel, that channel is broken down into multiple subcarriers. So there's this physical layer technology called OFDM, orthogonal frequency division multiplexing, which splits up the channel into these subcarriers, and that allows the Wi-Fi communication to be more resilient to interference and also achieve higher throughput. And in addition, most equipment these days is also fitted with multiple antennas. So again, that allows the Wi-Fi technology to leverage these simultaneous transmissions to increase the data rate, right? What that means from our perspective is that you can capture a lot of this fine-grained information, this channel state information. So the amplitude and phase of these subcarriers can actually be recorded. So in our work, we were using 30 subcarriers. That's why you see the number 30 here. And you can do that for multiple combinations of receiver and transmitter antennas. Okay. And the fluctuations that you see in this CSI is actually representing of various things that are happening in the ambient space. So this could be reflections, interference, whatever, anything that's untoward gets captured in the CSI. And the logic being that the actions the individuals are performing are also creating these interferences, which then get recorded in the CSI. So the typical use case for this work is as shown here. We assume that you might have installed these Wi-Fi sensors, particularly in doorways, say in an apartment. Perhaps it's being used to monitor an elderly individual and so on and so forth. The logic being that whenever they would walk through these virtual gates, if you may, we may be able to detect who that person is and in which direction they were walking. So why does this work? Well, the intuition here is, again, if you have a virtual gate like this, and if you're walking through it, right? So whenever you walk through it, you create a certain pattern. And since your gate is kind of very characteristic, so if you have two people walking through this, when person A walks through it, it would create a particular pattern. When person B walks through that virtual gate, person B would create a different pattern. So that's the intuition, that each of us has a slightly different gate, and that can get manifested in different and cause different interference in the Wi-Fi signals. And we can then use those patterns to train a machine learning algorithm to be able to identify these individuals. So in order to do that, of course, there's a lot of signal processing involved. So this is actually the pipeline that we use. And again, as with any of this work, we assume we can train the system, right? So we collect some training data for the individuals, and then we build the model, test it using actual testing data. So this is the pipeline. I won't go into all the nitty-gritty here. There's a bit of, as I said, signal processing involved. So we capture the signals in that particular setting that I showed you. Then we do some silence removal, essentially, which allows us to just zoom in on this pattern here, where the signal is most dominant as the person walks. Then we actually estimate the direction of walking. We can actually, our system can tell if the person is moving left to right or right to left based on the variations in the signal. Then we do some feature extraction, because this information that we are capturing is humongous. So we can't just feed all of that to a machine learner, that it would just be too much. So we need to extract out certain features that are most representative of the gate. And then we run it through a deep learning, attention-based deep learning model. Right? So I'll kind of just touch very briefly on some of this, leaving out a lot of the nitty-gritty. So one thing we found was the direction in which you mount the antennas actually impacts the signals. So we found that if you mounted the antennas in a horizontal direction, now of course this is a sort of expanded view. If you look at a Wi-Fi router, there's you can imagine those antennas that you see, right? So that's what we refer to here. So we found that in this particular setting, as you notice here, this is a person walking forward and a person walking backward. So you see the signals are actually an exact flip, right? So this part here matches this. So it's like a mirror image, essentially, that creates. So this actually helps us very easily figure out the direction of walking. So here we use something called principal component analysis, which allows us to reduce the amount of data that we try to process. And then we use the short-term energy over successive frames, and basically use least square optimization to estimate the direction. So very simply put, we look at the slope. And if the slope is increasing, it means the person is walking left to right. If the slope is decreasing, it means the person is walking right to left. Then we focus on trying to find out what features are most representative of the individual, of the gate, essentially, as they're walking through. So here this is showing you some spectrogram, essentially converting the signals to the frequency domain. And we've found that in a particular band, this particular band was most discriminating amongst the individuals. So we look at some very basic spatiotemporal features. And these are the 10 specific features that we've actually used. Next, we use deep learning, and in particular, we use an attention model. So this first calculates the importance of the feature weights of the different type of features that I showed you, and then exploits this feature projection network to focus on effective features that help us discriminate amongst the individuals. And this is also independent of the walking direction. And then we feed it through a combination of ResNets and RNN to extract the spatiotemporal patterns in the CSI. So again, I'll leave out all the nitty-gritty here. We can discuss this offline, or I can point you to the paper. Now, in terms of the experiments, again, this was restricted to a university setting. So this is showing you some pictures, for example, how we collected the data. So we just used, again, standard off-the-shelf devices, a router, a simple laptop to do the measurements, and just university students to test this system. So here are some details that you see there. The first thing we, of course, check is the walking direction estimation, which was fairly high, 92%. And then we test how good is the accuracy of the system. So this down here is showing you the accuracy of the system as a function of this group size. So essentially, you're trying to identify one individual out of a group of n, and n was varied from, say, 6 to 20. So as the size of the group increased, the accuracy did drop. So this is something that we are still need to work on, but it's still promising. I mean, if you look at 20 group setting, we are still able to get close to 80% accuracy. We do notice so this is the confusion matrix. So we do notice there are certain individuals in particular that are giving us low accuracy, and we kind of, these individuals we noticed are essentially of the same height, very similar structure, and so on and so forth. So apparently and perhaps their walking gait is very similar as well, right? So that led to
Professor Kanhere will need to wrap it up. Do you mind doing it? Thank you. Sorry.
Perfect. So yeah, so in fact, that's all I have to say. There's a few things I'll just quickly highlight some other work we've been doing. So with this wireless stuff, we've been able to show that we could actually monitor your breathing rate in a restricted setting. We have also done a lot of work on using these patterns to do second factor authentication. So for example, if you ask an individual to sign their signature in the air, right, that also could be picked up through the disturbance they cause. And we are able to actually recognize the individual by doing that. We were able to also show we can detect your cardiopulmonary activity in this context. So few last words here. So there are certainly a lot of pervasive computing applications emerging, which require us to know the identity of the individuals. And in these sort of settings, it is highly desirable to do authentication in a non-intrusive manner. So I think that's where this whole idea of using Wi-Fi signals is very attractive. But of course, there's a lot more to be done. So for example, all our systems assume that there's a single person in that room, right? As soon as you have multiple people, the system doesn't work. So there's a lot more work to be done to make this work in a real practical setting. Of course, testing it out with larger users would also be nice. And then the flip side of all this is the privacy, right? Given that all of this can happen without the individual even knowing that it's happening, there are certainly some privacy discussions to be had around it. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for your time. Happy to take any questions or comments.
Professor Kanhere, thank you so much for such an excellent talk and showing us your cutting edge research with you and your team. It was really, really interesting. And I know there's probably a lot more we can learn from you. And I look forward to that in the future as well.